Mouthwashing. Characters. Video game. Characters. Fridge. Nightmare fuel. Trivia. YMMV. Create subpage. Create new. Analysis archive awesome derivative work. Fanworks fanficari cs funny haiku head scratchers heartwarming image links image source laconic. Media notes newsletter playing with quote source quotes recap referenced by shocking. Tearjerker timeline WMG. Tropes for the characters of mouthwashing. Open/close all folders. Toll-par crew. The crew in general. Dysfunction junction. Everyone in the crew has a very big flaw that proves to be fatal. 5-man band, an almost classic example. Kali's the leader, Jimmy's the foil, Daisuke's the heart, Anya's the brains, and Swansea's the brawn. Ragtag bunko of misfits. Given the many cut corners, it's only natural that the crew aren't exactly the most competent people. Jimmy. For better or worse, I'm captain now. The main playable protagonist and co-pilot of the Toll-par. Asshole victim, practically everything goes wrong for him, but considering he's the one that condemns himself and everyone else to the nightmarish situation they're all stuck in and repeatedly makes it all worse by being a toxic asshole who can't take responsibility, it's safe to say he brought it on himself. Best friend, he and Curly go way back, with Jimmy serving as Kali's second and confidant on the Toll-par. Unfortunately he wasn't exactly a good friend, and yet even after everything he did he still seems to think of Curly as his friend and believes the latter feels the same. Big bad, not only is Jimmy a horrible person, he's also directly and personally responsible for the catastrophic situation the crew finds themselves in. He may not have gotten them all fired, but he intentionally crashed the ship to kill everyone and then made things even worse through his bad leadership. The chains of commanding. Despite basically promoting himself into the Toll-par's de facto captain since Curly can obviously no longer serve as such, Jimmy does not take the pressure well at all, and later laments to Curly that he never realized before how much pressure the responsibility of being a captain was. Driven to suicide, in the end he chooses to use the emergency pistol on himself after giving up the last cryopod to Curly. Fair weather friend. When he and Curly are getting along they banter and talk like close brothers, but the moment things get dicey or Curly brings up anything in conversation that rankles Jimmy he is often quick to start sniping and slinging accusations at everyone including Curly himself. And when he tries and fails to crash the Toll-par in a bungled murder-suicide gambit, Jimmy blames it all on Curly to save his own skin. Fatal flaw. His inability to take responsibility for any of his actions is a massive driving point for the plot, to the point that the phrase "take responsibility" features as the game's arc words. He also rarely acts with forethought or concern for how his actions will affect other people both immediately and in the long run, only focusing on trying to fix the immediate problem in front of him but in the process often making the problem worse or screwing himself and the others over further down the line. Overall, both of the aforementioned flaws boil down to the fact that Jimmy is a very self-centered person, as any time he's called out or confronted by the consequences of his short-sighted and selfish actions he always deflects the blame and makes himself out to be the victim or the hero of the situation. He also tends to make every situation somehow come back to himself, insulting everybody and dismissing their feelings while complaining about how hard everything is for him specifically despite rejecting offers of advice or aid in his insistence that he can do it right on his own. Green-eyed monster, he expresses envy towards Kali's career as a captain and the way that everyone constantly praises him for his competence and successes. It explains part of his reason for crashing the ship, as he resented the idea that Curly might go on to have a chance at a successful career after Pony Express goes down while Jimmy would likely end up with nothing and little to no chance of landing another job. Heroic wannabe, he fancies himself destined for greater things and after becoming the acting captain of the Toll-par following Kali's incapacitation, he seems to think that he can somehow be the hero of the situation by guiding the crew through the crisis and solving all their problems. Unfortunately, he's simply not cut for the job as he caves to the pressure of responsibility, refuses to admit to his screw ups and continues to make things worse with his lack of forethought in his attempted solutions, on top of generally being a jerk to everyone. Ignored epiphany. Several times he is faced with evidence or someone, even his own hallucinating guilty conscience, telling him outright that he's not nearly doing as good a job as he thinks he is at fixing the situation that he caused in the first place. Even at the end, after Paul tells him off for being a narcissistic jerk who ruined everything, he continues to insist he can still fix everything if given another chance. While alone with Curly at one point, Jimmy has a moment of clarity where he admits that being captain is much more difficult than he ever realized, telling Curly he was a good captain. Sadly, it doesn't stop Jimmy from refusing to take responsibility and making everything worse. "Jimmy, I don't think I understood the pressure you were under before. Fuck. And you tried to tell me." Insistent terminology. He insists that the crew refer to him as the captain after he steps up as acting captain following the crash and Curly's injuries, putting him out of commission, as well as pressing for them to stop referring to Curly as captain too. Jerk with a heart of jerk, he is an abrasive and belittling individual even in his introductory scenes at the start of the game, but one might chalk it up to the stress of the situation at first, plus he seems to be genuine in his attempts to make things work within the awful situation he and the Tulpar crew find themselves in, as well as showing concern for Curly's state. As the game progresses, he unfortunately proves to be little more than a self-centered jerk at his core as his mistakes pile up and he refuses to acknowledge his wrongs, blaming everyone else for their problems and remaining rude and self-absorbed at every opportunity. Meaningful name. His name is a common diminutive of James, which is sometimes thought to be a derivative of the biblical name Jacob, meaning supplanter or holder of the heel note. He always felt second best to Curly, who was more successful and liked than him, and his resentment of Curly contributed to his decision to crash the Tulpar in a fit of despair before taking over the captaincy after Curly was incapacitated in the aftermath. Never my fault. One of his biggest flaws. Jimmy continuously refuses to acknowledge his screw ups and take responsibility for his actions, instead blaming everyone and everything else and sinking deeper and deeper into the delusion that he can somehow fix everything. It's revealed that he's the one who got everyone stranded by trying to crash the Tulpar out of despair because he didn't want to take responsibility for Anya and their child after he got her pregnant through what is heavily implied to have been non-consensual sex. Pet the dog. In a delusional attempt to help him, Jimmy puts Curly in the cryopod to give him a chance at surviving before committing suicide. Psychopathic man-child, a subtle example, as everything bad that happens is the result of Jimmy's inability to take responsibility or think his all actions all the way through. "The reason you suck" speech, he gives one to Curly in the flashbacks and near the end of the game, voicing his misgivings about how Curly doesn't understand the hardships of the less well-off people working under him due to his higher-ranking position and respectable career as a captain. Though it should be taken with more than a grain of salt since Jimmy is clearly envious of Curly and tends to twist the situation with self-centered or bad faith interpretations, as there is no indication that Curly looks down on any of the crew nor that he lacks empathy for their hardships. Sanity slippage. After the Tulpar crashes, putting Curly out of commission and stranding the crew in a remote system with slim hope of rescue, the stress of being suddenly promoted to the captaincy and becoming responsible for keeping everyone alive and not at one another's throats does a number on his mental stability. It only gets worse when the despair and paranoia sets in as he and the crew start to get drunk off the ethanol mouthwash. Small name, big ego. He is under the impression that he can be a much better captain than Curly and generally looks down on everyone aboard the Tulpar like they are the resident screw ups and jerks, despite showing little merit of his own to back his attitude up. Indeed, once he becomes the acting captain, he quickly proves he can't really handle the responsibility of the role because he lacks both the experience and temperament needed to be a good leader. Unreliable narrator. The parts of the game in which we play as him initially paint him as a beleaguered survivor trying his best in the horrible situation he and his colleagues have found themselves in, but as time goes on and his sanity wanes, it becomes increasingly clear he seems to be having delusions about what's happening around him and his competency. Villain protagonist. As the game progresses and we get to see scenes of Jimmy interacting with Curly and the crew before the crash, it becomes clear that he is far from the hero of the story. He is directly responsible for the crash that stranded the Tulpar and left Curly in critical condition. He impregnated Anya, possibly non-consensually, while also refusing to take any responsibility for her and their child, and he eventually ends up causing the deaths of the entire crew both directly and indirectly in his misguided attempts to fix the situation. Curly. Pained breathing. Click here for Curly before the crash. The captain of the Tulpar and Duder agonist who is horrifically maimed after the ship crashed. And I must scream, after the crash, Curly loses the use of both his limbs and voice, outside of pained crying. He is in constant agony from the severity of his injuries, which are so horrific one could easily mistake him for dead, if it weren't for the grunts and sobs. Because he can no longer communicate, it's unknown as to whether Curly wants to be saved or not, but Jimmy surely doesn't give him a choice in the matter. He shoves painkillers down Curly's throat, force feeds Curly a piece of his own leg in an attempt to help him survive, no matter how many times Curly throws it up, and at the very end of the game, for better or for worse locks Curly into the last remaining cryogenic chamber to prolong his chances of being rescued for another 20 years. The game emphasizes Curly's helplessness by shifting the camera to his POV once Jimmy puts him inside the chamber. From then all the player can do is look around aimlessly as Curly's close friend kills himself off-screen. Bandage Mummy, a horrifying example. After basically being at the cockpit during the Tulpar's head-on crash, he is left incapacitated and badly burned all over his body, leaving him with only one undamaged eye, but no eyelid, exposing his teeth, with no lips, lacking both his hands and feet. Benevolent boss, as the Tulpar's captain he was highly respected and beloved by his crew as he was close to all of them, always doing his best to act as a rational but caring leader towards them even when there was interpersonal friction or their suboptimal working conditions were getting to them. Best friend, he and Jimmy were good friends who go way back, Curly having helped Jimmy secure his current position as his co-pilot as a favor to help him. Sadly this doesn't save him from Jimmy's narcissism and generally unpleasant and toxic personality, which is what ends up getting Curly severely injured and his entire crew killed in the end. Body horror, being in the cockpit when the ship crashed headfirst into a planetary body left him severely mutilated and permanently bedbound. All his skin has been burnt off, he's missing all of his limbs and is also down one eye, while his remaining eyelid, lips, and nose are entirely gone. And yet he's still alive 2 months after the crash. The captain, he's an experienced long-haul freight ship captain and in charge of the Tulpar and its small crew. Everyone working under him respects him highly and he looked out for all of them in kind. Fatal flaw, Curly's major flaw was that he prioritized keeping the crew functional over anything else, usually through placation. Given Pony Express Company's training in regards to mutiny, aka, kill the mutineer, he may have been trying to avoid a situation where he would have to resort to deadly force. Regardless, his decision to mediate situations instead of punishing or confronting fellow crewmates ultimately led to the main conflict of the game. Instead of taking responsibility as captain and properly reprimanding Jimmy for non-consensually impregnating Anya, Curly ends up reassuring Jimmy that they'll work things out despite Jimmy's clear unrepentant and poor mental state. In the process, Curly leaves Jimmy in a position where he is able to hijack and purposefully crash the ship when he should have had all access to the cockpit removed given his unreliable state. A fate worse than death, getting all his skin and limbs burnt and blown off in the crash is just the start of his suffering. With the ship in poor condition, undersupplied and understaffed, Curly spends weeks in total immobile agony unable to even move or eat on his own, constantly dosed up on painkillers which do little for his wretched condition. Then he slowly watches his friends and crewmates crumble to the miserable situation they are stuck in, until all of them are dead bar one, with one even having committed suicide right in front of him, and she also happened to be the only medic on the crew who was looking after him. All he has left is Jimmy, who was responsible for the crash in the first place and has deluded himself into believing he can make things right even after effectively killing everyone else off through his own incompetence. In a delusional attempt to help Curly, he forces Curly to cannibalize his own leg before shutting him in a cryopod that only works for 20 years and then blowing his own brains out, leaving Curly the sole survivor of the Tulpar and doomed to likely die alone and in agony after 20 years, or else live the rest of his life physically and mentally destroyed in the slim chance he manages to be rescued and somehow survives. Good all along, he wasn't the one who crashed the tulpar, and he tried to be a good captain and friend to his crew. His buddy Jimmy, on the other hand. The grotesque, as the game goes on, Kali's scarred and mutilated appearance goes from horrific to horrific, but for an entirely different reason. His only real sin was enabling Jimmy's behavior. He's otherwise one of the most decent people on the ship, a sharp contrast to the sorry state of his body in the present. Hair of gold, heart of gold, the final flashback shows him pre-mutilation where he had curly blonde hair. He was beloved by his entire crew while he served as their captain and was kind and caring towards all of them, to a fault. Laser-guided karma, while Curly is one of the nicest people in the game, he did downplay Anya's distress when she said she didn't want to be near Jimmy, as she felt vulnerable near him. Once told of the reason why she felt that way, instead of being a good captain and reprimanding Jimmy for his horrific behavior, he reassures Jimmy and does not strip him of his responsibilities, leading to Tulpar's crash. After the crash, Curly is completely at Jimmy's mercy, and is treated less like a person and more of someone to project onto. Mirthless laughter. After Jimmy picks up the emergency gun in front of him, he starts to cackle in a painful-sounding manner, presumably at the realization of just how bad things have gotten for everyone. Could also cross into laughing mad territory, given it's hard to imagine he's got much sanity left after everything that's happened to him up until this point in the game. Nice guy. The flashbacks in which he is playable show that he was a good captain to his crew, who made the most of their sub-par situations and always tried to do right by and support everyone. No good deed goes unpunished. His guilty conscience causes him to tell the crew early about the news that Pony Express is going under and they will all be laid off after finishing their last transport job, reasoning that it's better not to keep such a big secret from them for so long. This ends up upsetting everyone, especially Jimmy, who proceeds to crash the ship deliberately in an impulsive murder-suicide attempt as the news compounded with everything else he has been dreading and hating throughout the trip tips him over the edge. Thus begins the plot of the game, and the beginning of everyone's suffering. The speechless, the crash has rendered him completely unable to communicate. The only noises he can make are pained breathing noises, crying to himself and brief laughter. Anya. I have to believe that our worst moments don't make us monsters, Jim. The resident nurse aboard the Tulpar. Blood from the mouth. Due to her method of suicide being via an overdose of oral meds, her corpse is shown covered in blood all over her front coming from her mouth. Brainy brunette, implied by the fact that despite Jimmy demeaning her abilities and squeamishness as a nurse, which isn't a fair assessment when coming from him, she managed to keep Curly alive for months with highly limited and poor quality resources, owns many medical texts in her office and was able to infer important details like the fact that the ethanol mouthwash wouldn't be useful to the crew for even disinfectant due to its sugar content. All these signs point to the fact that despite her circumstances she is a smart and resourceful nurse who can do her job fairly well even in suboptimal conditions, and with the mention that she only went through nursing school. Break the cutie. Before the crash she was somewhat gloomy but otherwise good woman trying her best with the poor hand given to her by life, and we see that at least around Curly she could be pleasant and had hopes for the future despite the less than stellar conditions of her current career. However, she learns not long into the trip that the moment their delivery is completed the company is going under and she will be let go, and she has no savings to fall back on. Then the crash happens, stranding her with a group of unstable male colleagues while the one person she really trusted to keep her safe, the captain, is horrifically disfigured and on the brink of death, and she is left looking after him constantly with little to no adequate medical supplies or support on hand. Also just before the crash she learns she is pregnant, and the father is not only a total jerkus but is implied to have raped her, and is now currently the acting captain of the vessel who constantly belittles and verbally abuses her while making it clear he's not interested in supporting her or their child if they even survive their current predicament. In the end she chooses to take her own life rather than continue living through the horrific conditions. Dreary half-lidded eyes. Her in-game model depicts her as having large eyes that are slightly drooping in a perpetually worried-looking expression to reflect her quiet and anxious disposition. Driven to suicide, she locks herself in the medical bay and overdoses on painkillers after the hopelessness and horror of the crew's situation becomes too much. XP, she bears a striking resemblance to Shelley Duvall's portrayal of Wendy Torrance from The Shining. Extreme doormat, she is often quick to back down when Jimmy insults or bullies her even in front of other people, ceding tasks to him and following his demands without question. Though considering the possibility Jimmy could have raped her and that she never felt comfortable around him even before things got bad, her withdrawn and submissive behavior may only be exclusive to him since she otherwise gets along fine around Swansea and Curly. Face death with dignity, after locking herself in the medical bay and being yelled at through the door by Jimmy, the last thing she is heard saying out loud is that despite her decision to take her own life via an overdose, she is making the choice to end her life on her own terms to preserve what dignity and safety she has left. Echoing her own words from earlier, she tells Jimmy, and possibly Curly too, that the decision is not her worst moment, but rather her best. Hospital hottie, she's a pretty woman and trained as a nurse to serve as the medical officer of the Tulpar. Nervous wreck, she is constantly on edge after the crash, sporting a permanently worried and tired expression and frequently trembling where she stands. Considering that she was all but outright stated to be raped by Jimmy, is pregnant under the worst of circumstances and is now his subordinate, it's more than justified. Nurse with good intentions, subverted. She's seen as inept given that she wasn't accepted in medical school and often pawns off the task of giving Curly his pills to Jimmy since she can't stand seeing Curly in pain. However, it's hinted that she is only perceived as inept since we are following Jimmy's perspective. Anya has several books on medical care in her office. She is able to tell that the stash of mouthwash on board would serve as a terrible disinfectant at a quick glance due to its high sugar content, which is proven correct later on in the game, and was able to treat and stabilize a patient with severe burns and amputated limbs for months despite her limited knowledge and supplies. Even her reluctance to treat Curly may be less about her inability as a nurse and more about her pregnancy, as becoming easily nauseous is a symptom of being pregnant. The Smuffet principle, the only female member of the crew. Too good for this sinful earth, she's just a nurse in the wrong job at the wrong company with the wrong person in the worst possible situation, and she is ultimately unable to hold out hope for rescue. Swansea. Do you hear that? That's the sound of 15 years of sobriety popping like a cyst. The Tulpar's grouchy mechanic and most senior member. The alcoholic, he reveals that he used to be one before going straight and sober for 13 years to clean up his life. This lasts until the discovery of the 13% ethanol mouthwash in the cargo hold sends him back to the bottle. Axe crazy, he obtains a fire axe sometime before the crash and hangs onto it. After the crash, when everyone's sanity starts to crumble, Swansea's alcoholism and increasingly short temper around everyone while openly wielding the axe starts making him seem more of a concern until one sequence has him coming after Jimmy in the cockpit, Jack Torrance style. Except it's subverted, because he had a damn good reason for wanting Jimmy's blood by that point. Plus his only actual direct kill, Daisuke, before that point was a mercy kill done in full gut-wrenching reluctance and awareness of what he was choosing to do. Face death with dignity, after being overpowered by Jimmy and facing the latter with a gun leveled at his head, Swansea simply gives Jimmy a calm and controlled speech as his last words about how he admits to his screwed-up life choices and alcoholism, but he's not ashamed to admit that to himself, and he calls Jimmy out for his constant selfishness and fuck UPS before welcoming the pull of the trigger. Fat bastard, he's a tubby and cantankerous man, rarely having anything positive to say to anyone and displaying a bad temper. That said, he's not all bad even at his worst, as he turns out to have a good reason for becoming so hostile to Jimmy. Foil, he and Jimmy are the biggest assholes on the ship, but as it turns out, he's only the second biggest by a fairly wide margin. Notably, both are the last able-bodied members of the crew to die and are particularly focused on saving another member of the crew, but when the situation becomes unsalvageable, Swansea is willing to accept reality for what it is and kills Daisuke to spare him an even worse existence, which stands in stark contrast to Jimmy trying to save Curly up until his last breath out of a desperate need to be the hero. Hero antagonist, Swansea is the only member of the crew who's both experienced and strong-willed enough to stand up to Jimmy, and despite his rough attitude, he usually has good reasons for doing so. It says a lot that the achievement you get for letting him kill Jimmy in the graveyard sequence 10 times is named the good ending. Jaded washout, he's an old recovering alcoholic who, in his efforts to sort his life out and keep himself on the straight and narrow, has dedicated much of his life to the Pony Express. His menial dead-end job, combined with an implied unhappy domestic life, has worn him down to a deeply bitter, cynical man. In his final moments prior to Jimmy killing him, he admits that his attempts at being normal have left him miserable and unfulfilled, and that the happiest time of his life were his years as an alcoholic. Jerk with a heart of gold, he is revealed to have genuinely cared about Daisuke despite constantly berating the latter and complaining about having to mentor him. Enough that he is worried out of his mind for Daisuke's sake after the latter gets critically wounded, rushing to find something to treat his injuries before he ends up tearfully performing a mercy kill on him after Daisuke's condition only gets worse. It is also strongly implied that he was saving the last working cryopod for Daisuke since he believed out of all the crew Daisuke deserved the chance to live the most as the youngest and most innocent of them all. Like a son to me, Swansea mentions he already has kids but doesn't think very highly of them or his wife, but despite his constant grumpiness towards Daisuke, it's hinted that deep down he cares about him more than his actual kids because he sees that despite his shortcomings Daisuke is a good kid who has the potential to be and do a lot better than Swansea in his dead-end job. Meaningful name: while swans are known for their elegant looks, they can be aggressive and quick to attack, befitting Swansea's harsh demeanor. What's more, they usually show this kind of behavior to anyone who wanders too close to their chicks. Swansea only comes after Jimmy with an axe after he talks Daisuke into sustaining a fatal injury. Not so different remark, he gives one to Jimmy during his final speech. Swansea also had a troubled past he was trying to escape from. One where he was a selfish good-for-nothing drunk. Except Swansea was successful. The only problem was he never felt as fulfilled as he thought he would. At the end of it all, despite having no regrets about leaving that life behind, he still enjoyed being a selfish bastard far more than he ever did taking responsibility. Swansea, a loving wife? Great kids? Sobriety? I'm telling you. Accomplishments I've been chasing my whole life. Never felt as good as I expected when I crossed the finish line. Rage breaking point, Swansea dealt with the crash about as well as he could have, alcoholism notwithstanding, but after Jimmy knocks him out with a spiked drink, gets Daisuke mortally injured by ignoring all of Swansea's warnings about the vent and utility, confesses he used their only bottle of actual disinfectant to spike said drink and then has the gall to accuse Swansea of trying to save his own skin with the only working cryopod. Swansea completely snaps and goes after Jimmy with the emergency axe in hand. The fact that he heavily implies Anya told him about what Jimmy did to her, as well as the fact that she just committed suicide, likely didn't help. He calms back down when Jimmy is about to execute him, but it's clear that he's speaking his last words with pure tranquil fury. Sanity slippage. After breaking his 15-year sobriety streak he falls back into his alcoholic ways, which sees him going through all the mood swings and volatile flares of temper that come with excessive alcohol abuse, on top of the stress of the post-crash situation getting to him as much as the rest of the crew. Though in the end, even though he is far from stable by the time it's come down to his and Jimmy's confrontation, it's hard to say he was ever truly insane considering he had a very good reason to try to hurt Jimmy by that point and he is perfectly lucid in his final moments. Sour outside, sad inside, Swansea's not a very approachable guy, but it's only because he's been beaten down by his bad life experiences. Decades of working a dead-end job and struggling with addiction have given him a deeply jaundiced view of life. Team Dad, a grouchy alcoholic dad, but beggars can't be choosers. For what it's worth, it's implied that Anya confided in him about her implied rape by Jimmy and he obviously has some fondness for Daisuke in spite of all his griping. The reason you suck speech, he gives one to Jimmy just before the latter executes him, blaming him for being a selfish, deluded and foolish man who coveted the role of a leader but utterly failed to display the skill or integrity befitting one, all while worsening their situation in his short-sighted attempts to fix everything because of his own egotism. Daisuke. Man. Pony Express bosses really aren't chill at all, hey? Man. A quick look wouldn't hurt. A cheerful young intern working under Swansea. All for nothing, he is beside himself with worry for Anya and Curly after the former locks herself in the medical bay and goes to great lengths to work with Jimmy to find a way in to rescue them both. By the time he's done dragging himself through a dangerous vent and bleeds half to death to reach her, Anya has already taken her own life. Asian airhead, Daisuke is Japanese and he's the most inexperienced and scatterbrained member of the crew. Casanova wannabe, he fantasizes about picking up girls at the beach in one scene and brightens up when Jimmy remarks that in the event they make it back from their ordeal alive, their story of survival might make him popular with the ladies. Drowning my sorrows, one scene has Jimmy stumbling upon him drunk off the mouthwash as it seems his unfailing optimism has reached its limit, and for the first time Daisuke voices aloud the very real prospect of the crew dying and never being rescued. Good as dumb. He's enthusiastic and chipper but naive and he doesn't really know a thing about being a mechanic or freight shipping. At the very least he's one of the nicest guys on the crew even after everyone else's sanity takes a plunge. Ironic name, his name means great help in Japanese. As an intern he isn't the most helpful guy due to his utter lack of experience or knowledge in the field, though not for lack of enthusiasm or trying. Mercy kill. He is put out of his misery by Swansea via an axe to the face after he sustains mortal injuries trying to use a broken vent to reach the medical wing. Mama's boy, he shows hints of this as when he speaks about his parents it's primarily about his mother, and he often worries about her and how she might take his predicament should news of the Tulpar's plight ever make it back home. Nice guy, he is easily the most optimistic and friendliest member of the crew, being eager to help and not having a single bad word or thought for any of the crew including his cranky boss Swansea. Senseless sacrifice, Daisuke gets himself mortally injured trying to enter the medical room through the broken air vent to save Curly and Anya, only to discover that she already killed herself via painkiller overdose. He dies not long after. Shoo out the clowns, his horrific injury and death marks the point where an already dark game completely loses its meager scraps of levity. Surfer dude, he wears Hawaiian shirts and speaks super casually, once telling Anya that he views his current job as totally awesome, like so awesome. Sweet tooth, he not so subtly hints that he has been secretly stealing the strictly rationed sweetener packets provided to the crew, and shows excitement and enthusiasm over the prospect of trying the cake and sweetened mocktails offered by the kitchen facilities. Token minority, he is the only Asian member of the crew. Too good for this sinful earth, as Daisuke lies dying from his wounds, Swansea laments that Daisuke wasn't made out to be one of the crew, because he was too happy and innocent and deserved better things than getting stuck in a dead-end job full of jaded and surly washouts and dying alone in a squalid shipwreck in the middle of nowhere. Swansea tells Daisuke that he may not have been ambitious or hyper-competent but he was a good kid doing his best and that if Swansea had actually had the chance to mentor him, a bitter old man like him would have learned a thing or two back from Daisuke and been better for it but now that would never be. Wardrobe flaw of characterization. Unlike the rest of the crew who wear standard-issue jumpsuits and polo shirts as part of the Pony Express uniform, Daisuke wears a gaudy Hawaiian shirt over his polo to reflect his youthful and cheerful personality. It also reflects how he was a last-minute addition to the crew as an intern who is inexperienced in anything to do with mechanics or long-haul freight shipping, as he treats the whole trip more like a fun holiday adventure and doesn't always seem to grasp the truly dire circumstances the crew is in after the crash because of this sunny optimism. Wide-eyed idealist, he is consistently the most optimistic member of the crew, believing the best in everyone and always speaking about their dire situation with the attitude that they will all survive and bounce back from the horrors. They don't, but Daisuke still manages to remain the least despairing of the lot in the end. Others. Pony Express Company. The intergalactic delivery corporation whom the Tulpar and its crew perform long-haul deliveries for. Bad boss, it's no secret that whoever the higher UPS of the company are, they shamelessly promote the abysmal working conditions and draconian rules that the Tulpar crew have to live and work under during their jobs. This includes limiting workers' sleep and recreation time, rationing their food arbitrarily, and having very lax standards when it comes to health and safety regulations. Capitalism is bad. The company exemplifies an almost satirical depiction of a typically greedy and banal business which routinely cuts corners on resources, expenses, and safety regulations while abusing its workers in the interest of profit, all while harping on about productivity and how great working for them is. In the end, they end up going bankrupt, though possibly not due to their unethical business practices but simply because they were being outperformed by their rivals. And of course they decide to lay off all their employees without any support or proper severance, let alone much proper notice. Incompetence, Inc., their horrendous workplace standards and cutting corners on health and safety for their workers shows throughout the game and contributes to the increasingly worse situations the stranded crew find themselves in. Highlights include and are not limited to having lax psychological evaluation standards, locking many resources and emergency tools behind a code scanner only the captain possesses and can use, adding an extra person to the crew last minute without accounting for the supplies required for them, and having an automatic system to fill hull breaches with insulation foam during the event of a crash which just ends up flooding the ship's interior to the point that it blocks off vital areas of the vessel that the crew would need access to in order to survive being marooned. Paul says, "Teamwork makes the dream work." The mascot of Pony Express who appears in promotional material all around the ship. Animalistic abomination, at the end of the game, Jimmy hallucinates a massive centipede creature made out of dozens of paws that screams like a baby and emerges from what appears to be a large, fleshy womb. Half-dressed cartoon animal, a horse who wears nothing but a polo shirt like the workers' uniforms. Invisible monsters. When Jimmy has to enter the cargo hold again to search for mouthwash, he encounters an enormous worm-like paw monster which is invisible to the naked eye. The only way he can see it is by shining the code scanner on it, else he has to listen out and watch for signs of it disturbing the boxes around him. Mascot, for the Pony Express Company, being present on all of their motivational posters, as well a big statue in the lounge that speaks company slogans when someone walks by it. Meaningful name, Paul's name is most likely derived from the word pal, pronounced the same as Paul, which is the Swedish equivalent to horsey. Off-screen teleportation, Jimmy comes across Paul's standing statue several times around the ship during his segments, in which it seems the horse is somehow able to move around when he's not looking, reflecting Jimmy's fraying sanity. The reason you suck speech, in one of the final mind-screwy sequences, Jimmy ends up talking to a hallucination of Paul who calls him out over his selfish behavior, dooming the entire crew and his inability to own up to his mistakes and culpability. Previous Index